this is what a nutrient intake distribution looks like. And I have up here the doses, the poison, because you can see that if you have too little or too much of a nutrient, that is problematic. And so using this paradigm, if we flip it on its head, we sort of can see the dietary reference intakes. So along the y-axis is the risk of inadequacy, and the observed level of intake across the x-axis. So at the EAR, there's a 50% chance of an inadequacy. And the RDA is 2 standard deviations above that value. And when we want to assess the people who are at those tails of the distribution, and I'm reminded, I hate to keep putting you on the spot, Beth, but Beth taught me on my first day at the Office of Dietary Supplements that that's where public health decisions are made, at the tails of the distribution. And so we don't just want to look at one day's intake and say you're at risk, because that might be different from day to day. We know there's considerable amount of variability. For example, yesterday I had kale at both lunch and dinner. I hadn't had kale since Christmas. So if I wanted to look at my usual vitamin A intake, I wouldn't just want to look at yesterday's intake. And of course, that's of importance as well, not only when you're looking at those tails of the distribution, but also when you want to relate nutrient intakes to health outcomes. What is your usual exposure? And so we can't measure usual exposure. We only have short and long-term instruments to measure dietary intake. We don't have anything that measures usual dietary intake. So I just put this up here as a reminder of what we have available to us. So both of the methods that we have, those short and long-term instruments, are subject to different types of measurement error. They are collected over different periods of time, 24-hour recall versus whatever the food frequency time period could be, 30 days, could be 1 year. So they're measured over different periods of time. They have different error structures. So you can't necessarily just add them together and assume someone's usual intake. And it's interesting and it's important that we have both of these types of information. And we need that because for some dietary supplements, for example, they may be taken episodically instead of habitually. So it's nice to have information from long-term and short-term types of measurement instruments. And of course, dietary recommendations don't need to be met every single day. And what we typically work with in NHANES is a 24-hour recall, and this is an excellent measure of daily intake. But as I mentioned, there's considerable variability, but it has random error. It has less systematic error than food frequency questionnaires, and finally, it's not reflective of usual long-term intake. It's reflective of the last 24 hours. And of course, what we want is usual nutrient intake, as I mentioned, to look at those tails of the distribution, to look at who's getting too much and who's not getting enough. But the challenge is that you can't measure or observe usual intakes because they're measured with error. And if we ignore this error, we are going to have biased estimates. But fortunately, we have statistical models available that can help us correct some of this bias. And this is a diagram showing you, if we looked at, in the red line, 1 day of dietary intake, and the blue line is the average of 2 24-hour recalls, and the green is usual intake. And you can see the impact that this makes on the percent of the group below this cut point of interest. So that's just a schematic to show you why this is so important. And there are a number of existing methods available to correct 24-hour recalls for within-person variability. And these are just a few of the available methods. But they're all based on a similar framework, and they all assume that the error in the 24-hour recall is random, and that we can separate the within and between-person variance and remove the within-person variability from that daily measure to make it reflective of long-term exposure. And these models are also important because we can account for what is referred to as nuisance effects. So whether or not a 24-hour recall is collected during the week or on the weekends makes a difference because Americans tend to have higher caloric intakes on the weekends than they do on the weekdays. It also can account for the sequence of the recall, whether or not it's the first or the second day. People tend to report less food on the second day simply because they know that if you say you have a sandwich, they're going to ask you, well, what was on the sandwich? Did you have mustard? Was there mayonnaise? There's a lot of questions. So people kind of get smart that I'm going to report less food. So these models can help us account for that. And it also allows us to account for the mode of interview. And what I mean by that is whether someone is asking you face-to-face or over the telephone. People, as you can imagine, are more apt to be honest with you over the telephone because they're not seeing the judgment that you're giving them. You had chocolate cake 3 times yesterday. It's easier to report that on the telephone than it is in a face-to-face situation. So I'm a picture person, so the next 2 slides are going to be pictures. And all of these models that adjust for within-person variability have the same basic framework. And I'll say it as transform, model, shrink, and back transform. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in this top panel, we see a nutrient intake distribution in the original scale. And what we want is to have a distribution that approximates normality. And that's just not the way that dietary intake data is. So we have to apply some sort of transformation to it to approximate normality, and that's the second panel. And in that normal distribution, we can remove the within-person variability. And that's when I say the word shrink, it brings those tails of the distribution in. So when I say shrink, that's what I mean. It's making it tighter. And then we need to use this data, so we have to get it back into the original scale that we collected it in so that it's meaningful. So that's what the back transformation is. And so, as Alana mentioned, we don't just want to get usual nutrient intake, we have to get total nutrient intake. So nutrients from all sources. And at NHANES, we're lucky because we have information from foods, beverages, fortified foods, dietary supplements, and all prescription and over-the-counter medications. And so when we look at this procedure that I've been describing, we can see this is a schematic of calcium intake from foods. As I indicated in the earlier slide, it's not normal. But for the food intake, we apply a transformation, and isn't that a beautiful bell-shaped curve? And there's the mean intake of calcium from foods. But when we look at dietary supplements, it's just not that easy because we have this huge spike at 0, so those are people who don't use dietary supplements, and that can extend exponentially. Nutrients from foods are constrained within a total energy intake. But for dietary supplements, you can take as many as you want. There's no rate limiting step in the amount of nutrients you can get from dietary supplements. And this is just showing with the users removed what the distribution looks like, and for calcium extending all the way out to about 6,000 milligrams. So this is data from NHANES. This is just showing you some of the principles, not actually important technically. So when we try to apply a transformation to this to approximate normality, we have a problem because that does not look normal. And that's because supplements come in very discrete doses. So this corresponds to 200 milligrams, the first what I call a spike. And that's the most common dose in a multivitamin, multimineral, is 162. So that's where that spike comes from. And then there are a number of people, particularly older women, who take a specific calcium supplement either in addition to or in lieu of a multivitamin. So that's where we see the second spike occurring. So the distribution intakes from foods is easy to smooth because everybody eats. You have this nice pattern. But not everyone uses dietary supplements. So we have these spikes and skews in the distribution, and then we need to know how to model those to get at usual exposure. And of course, it's important to measure supplements, as Alana suggested, because for some nutrients, the intake from supplements is quite large. And the example she provided was vitamin D. Not too many reliable food sources, but you can get a lot of vitamin D from supplements. Adequacy and excess, those tails of the distributions that we're interested in here today, are underestimated if you only look at nutrient intakes from foods. And finally, some of the upper limits are only for nutrients derived from supplements or fortification, and that's the example for magnesium and for folic acid. And of course, it's important not only for those reasons, but because there is a high prevalence of use of dietary supplements, particularly in adults. So this is looking at NHANES data from 1999 until 2010. And sorry, Alana, I do have the data. It's not released yet, but I can tell you it hasn't changed that much. We know that males tend to report slightly lower supplement use than females, and so this is for adults 20 plus, and then this is for children. So it's been relatively stable, but we still see half of adults and about a third of children using supplements. So we simply cannot ignore nutrient intakes from dietary supplements. But we know very little about this error structure in the reports of dietary supplements. And so one of the things that we've been working on is understanding from the NHANES 2007 and 8 how to model supplement use, because historically for the last 30 years supplement use has been collected through a frequency questionnaire. How often in the last 30 days did you take a supplement? And now we have, in addition to that questionnaire, information from the 24-hour recall. So how well do those things match up? And so what I'm going to show you here is the agreement between the questionnaire and the 24-hour recall. So this is for any dietary supplement. So as you can see, the questionnaire, as you can imagine, has a slightly higher prevalence of use because there's more opportunities to take a supplement in 30 days than simply yesterday. And the example I'm going to be showing is for calcium. And this is the percent of users from day 1, day 2, and the questionnaire for calcium. Not that different. But in NHANES, what you have to understand is that the questionnaire is given in the home. So we say, did you take any supplements, and show me all your supplements, which is really important in getting the label so that we have the most accurate information. And then when they do the 24-hour recall, they said, you told us on your questionnaire that you took a supplement. So did you? So it's not surprising to me that we have such a good agreement here because they're being reminded of it. So it's not necessarily a fair comparison, but for what we do with NHANES, it's good. So this is actually the population. And so when I say population, Alana alluded to this, there are people who use supplements and people who don't. And if we want to say what's going on in the U.S. population, they are together as one group. So U.S. population average calcium exposure is about 140 milligrams. But if we look at just the users, we see, as you would expect, that's around 300 milligrams. So we have information from 24-hour recalls. We have information from the questionnaire. And how do we combine those nutrient intakes? I'm going to talk about two strategies today. The first is a basic strategy. You add one to the other, and you have it. I didn't invent that. That was math. And as Alana said, you can use that when you want the mean intake of a group. But you can't do that type of analysis when you want to look at who's getting too much or who's getting too little. So then we have adjusted. That's the second method. And by adjusted, I mean putting it through that transformation and the back transformation to get usual intakes. And I think we are all, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir in this room, but we all agree that adjusted nutrient intake distributions are what we want. And population monitoring. And that's great, but all of those methods have been developed for foods, not for supplements. So when are you going to add dietary supplements to the nutrient intake distributions? Are you going to add them before you adjust, or are you going to add them after you adjust? And so when I say before you adjust, I refer to it as add then shrink. So you take someone's intake from supplements and you add it to their foods, and then you put it through the statistical modeling. After means that you put the nutrient intakes from foods in the models, get your usual intake of nutrients from foods, then add your supplements. So that's called shrink, then add. And this is just some background. If you add supplements before you adjust, you assume that users and non-users are the same. And you're ignoring a covariate that we know users and non-users aren't the same. And it creates a multimodal distribution. Remember those spikes and skews that I was talking about? It makes it a little bit harder to deal with from a statistical perspective. So we looked at these three methods with calcium using the NHANES data from 2007 and 2008. And so I'm going to show you the total nutrient intake for girls 14 to 18. And this is a group that has been previously identified as having low calcium intakes. So this is the mean of the intakes for these girls using the three methods. And as you can see, not too terribly different. And in the first, anyway, there's my big finale before I was ready for it. But when we see the intakes of users, we expect them to be higher than non-users because they're taking extra calcium. And if we use this modeling technique where we add, then shrink, it produces the same exact mean for these people regardless of whether or not they use a supplement. And that's problematic because we know that's not the case. So when we look at the percent below the EAR, what do we see? So combined is users and non-users into one group. This is the percent of girls 14 to 18 not meeting the EAR for calcium. We see a similar pattern with the EAR. We're saying that regardless of whether or not you take a supplement, you still have the same risk as someone who doesn't. And again, that doesn't make sense. And this is looking at the difference between whether or not there's no adjustment. So, and that's what a lot of people do, is they just assume that they don't have to adjust the nutrient intake distributions. So you would say, if we did it this way, 63% of girls who use supplements are still at risk. And that's very different from the actual 38%. It's still alarming that 38% aren't meeting their calcium needs, but that's very different than 63%. So my take-home message is that the mean for a population is relatively the same no matter what you do, whether you do a basic analysis or an adjusted analysis, whether you add then shrink or shrink then add. If all you want is the mean of a group, you can do whatever you want. If you're interested in those tails, you have to first model the dietary intake from foods and then add supplement intakes. So while I had your attention, I thought I would just talk about a few of the challenges and considerations about working with dietary supplement data. There is this episodic versus habitual consumption of supplements, and that's why it's important to have information from both frequency methods and daily methods. For example, someone may use vitamin D only in the winter as a dietary supplement and not in the summer. Someone might use vitamin C when they feel cold coming on, even though there's no data to support that. We see that that happens all the time. So there is this episodic and habitual nature of consumption of supplements. For calcium, women take calcium like they take a drug. That's for osteoporosis. I take that every day. But for different supplements, we see different patterns, and that's something that we're working on right now. We have to accept that what people report is what they're taking. Moving targets and reformulations. Supplements, there are 50,000 different dietary supplements on the market right now, and the FDA estimates are that 1,000 new products are being added each month. In addition to those new products, there's reformulations. So Centrum Silver used to have, for men, used to have selenium in it, and then they got a slap on the wrist for the claim they made. Now it doesn't have selenium in it anymore. So these reformulations need to be accounted for when you're looking at nutrient exposure. Oftentimes, there is a default value assigned to dietary supplements which may or may not reflect actual intakes. And I have bioavailability as always being an issue, particularly we talked about folate, where folic acid is more bioavailable than folate from food sources. And then I just wanted to show you the difference between the analytical level of a nutrient versus the labeled level of a nutrient. And this is an ongoing project at the USDA that compares what's actually in the bottle with what's on the label. And you can see for some nutrients there's really no difference, for niacin, magnesium, zinc. But for some nutrients it really makes a difference. Iodine, selenium, and B6, there's upwards of 25% more in the bottle than what's on the label. So, in the last few moments that I have with you, I just wanted to share some of the data that we've worked together with the ILSI Fortification Committee. So we know that people who use supplements are different than people who don't use supplements. They tend to be older, females use more than males, non-Hispanic whites tend to use more than other racial and ethnic groups. Users tend to be more physically active and have higher education levels. So we know they're different in many ways. But what about their nutrient intakes for food? That was an interesting question that we wanted to explore. And so I'm going to show you the children's data in 2 slides. And I can tell you right now, very briefly, children who use supplements are no different than children who don't use supplements in terms of the food choices and nutrient intakes that they have. So that's the children's story in 1 sentence. What I'm showing you here, though, is the total intake of supplement users versus non-users. This is the percent of children who have intakes who are below the EAR. So you can see in the purple is for non-users across many vitamins and minerals, substantially different than people who use, or children who use dietary supplements. Particularly salient when you look at things like vitamin D and vitamin E. But what about the other end of the distribution, the UL? So for children who use supplements, these are the percentages in blue, the blue bar, of children who exceed the UL from nutrient intakes for various nutrients here. For adults, we saw something very different. Adults who use supplements had higher intakes of nutrients from foods, for females particularly, but also in males for almost every nutrient that we looked at. Higher intakes of nutrients from foods, and then they're also using dietary supplements. So let me show you what this means in terms of below the EAR. So this is the percent of adult population, this is females, with mineral intakes just from their diet. And in the red bar, we see users. This is their food intake. So blue is non-users, red is users. This is just from food. This isn't even looking yet at dietary supplements, and we see these differences. And then when we add supplements, we see a much different picture. So this is looking at calcium. Again, this was the example that I wanted to show you. Across all ages, what a difference using a calcium supplement makes in terms of meeting the EAR. This is the same slide orientation as I showed previously, but this is for the vitamins now in adults. Again, use dramatically lowers things like vitamin E. Looking at adult data on the intakes above the UL, and this is broken down by males and females. We see that there is prevalence of intakes above the UL for users, but not with the same dramatic percentages that we saw in children. So to summarize that portion of our work, we saw that there were no differences in vitamin or mineral intakes for children, and that we saw was different from adults, where we saw many differences. Users of supplements have a much higher percentage of meeting the EAR, particularly for vitamin D and vitamin E, but users of supplements also have higher intakes of, or higher prevalence of intakes rather, above the UL than non-users. And so just because we're talking about fortification, I wanted to show you the impact of fortification on a distribution. So supplements selectively add nutrients to people, but fortification picks up that entire distribution and moves it. So everybody along the continuum, people who have low intakes and people who have high intakes, are now getting more exposure to a nutrient. So I don't think I need to summarize this again. We've talked about many of these key points. And if you just want the mean of a group, you can statistically do anything you want and you're going to get the right answer. If you want those tails of the distribution, you have to apply some adjustment procedures. So I'd just like to say thank you. I feel honored to be in this group today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.